Hi, my name is Dr. Theresa Case. I teach at the University of Houston downtown. My presentation is Unionism and Defeat, the 1922 Railroad Shopmen Strike. Some years ago, I began to research the 1922 Railroad Shopmen Strike, an event that many Texans have never heard of. This was a national walkout by over 400,000 shop employees, railroad workers in the shops, maintained, repaired, reconstructed, and built the engines, cars, and operating equipment. These shopmen included machinists, blacksmiths, boilermakers, carpenters, welders, carmen, electricians, and their apprentices and helpers. They kept the wheels turning, in other words, in a sector of the economy that was critical. The railways in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, were akin to the internet today, but the railroads not only connected people economically and in terms of travel, along railway lines grew towns and cities with significant populations of railroad workers and their families. Many, Black and white, were the pillars of their communities. This was the case in Texas, just as it was elsewhere. Thus, when almost all railroad shopmen in Texas heeded the call for a national walkout on July 1st, 1922, this was of historic importance, as was their devastating defeat. I want to show you some quick images of shops in Cleburne, Texas, circa 1916. In Marshall, Texas, the Texas Pacific Railroad shop, massive shops, and the Cotton Belt Railway shops in Tyler, Texas. This is a newspaper article about the men who went out at Marshall. Again, about nearly 100% walkout at Marshall, as well as in railroad hubs across Texas. That was the case. So the strike commenced in July, but by September, it was in serious, arguably fatal trouble. The federal government had stepped in with widespread use of injunctions that outlawed most strike actions, whether they were peaceable or not. My presentation today zooms in on the records of strikers on the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, also called the Katy. These records involved the unions of skilled shop workers, unions that represented skilled white workers. I am looking at this later period, September through December 1922, when strikers were on the defensive nationally. Because the strikers were on the defensive nationally, I thought that I would find overwhelming evidence of desperate, disoriented Katy strikers in the fall of 1922. Indeed, Collin Davis, the reigning expert on the 1922 Shopmen strike, titled his chapter about this stage of the conflict, Disintegration. That chapter's major theme is in keeping with some of what I discovered in my research, to be sure. However, between September through December, the strikers on the Katy often did not see it that way. Many exhibited far more confidence and resolve than one might think would have been the case given their circumstances. To be clear, it is not that Katy shop workers were Pollyannish. They were jarred to see so many of their strike leaders arrested and in over a dozen Texas railroad towns to experience martial law. There were dwindling resources to deal with, and the sting of seeing the railroads bring in strikebreakers under the protection of federal injunction and state and local troops. Yet, Katy shopmen remained resolute, in part because they had reason to believe that their communities still stood with them. This comes across in the communications of their leaders with John Scott, an official of the Railway Employees Department, or RED. I'm going to call it RED throughout this presentation. RED was the national organization that led the shop workers' strike. To raise strike funds, local leaders reported to Scott that they had organized tag days, sold copies of the paper Labor, solicited donations from area merchants, put on shows, and held dances. Their strong backing was evident in various Labor Day festivities in early September, and in the commitment, just as an example, of a local theater in Tyler to reserve free shows for the benefit of strikers and their families. In late November, Texas strikers read in their strike circular about the crowds, 5,000 strong, who came out to show sympathy with strikers in Sedalia, Missouri, a key Katy Railroad shop point. Waco cotton truckers even pledged to each donate a full day's pay to the strikers every 2 weeks. The frequent calls for local shopcraft leaders for a Baltimore agreement further demonstrates the continued determination of shop workers. By Baltimore agreement, they meant the more liberal terms that the Baltimore and Ohio Railway had accepted to end the walkout on its lines. The B&O had brought back strikers and retained their seniority rights. With the Katy, they knew they would have to fight, because the Katy management was hard-boiled, as strikers put it. The Katy refused to deal at all with union representatives or to countenance recognition of seniority rights for any returning strikers. In the words of one shopman, without seniority rights, they might as well stay out. So in other words, they really stuck to the call for the Baltimore agreement, even though they knew that the Katy was going to be a lot tougher to deal with. Perhaps the strongest reason for the strikers' sustained good spirits was the trust that craft workers placed in their skills. Without their labor, they reasoned, the trains would not be able to move enough freight or passengers. Contributions to strike bulletins and circulars from the various towns along the Katy lines testified regularly and in great detail, as you can see, to the difficulties that the Katy met with in running its trains without them. They described engine failures, late trains, etc. This is a Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Line System Federation circular published in Parsons, Kansas, and it collected basically information from all of the different strike locales as to how things were going. And the largest amount of ink was spent really on describing the failures of the Katy in getting out railroad cars and kind of keeping equipment moving, keeping freight moving, etc. The growing presence of strikebreakers was of concern, but even this development seemed empty of real consequence in the long run for the striking shopmen. They held that strikebreakers were untrained at best or just terminally incompetent at worst. Most strikebreakers at Waco and elsewhere were cotton pickers, local federations reported. The argument about competence did have a racial edge to it, as white shopmen depicted black strikebreakers as particularly ill-suited for skilled work in the shops, even though black machinist helpers could step in to do machinist work, for example, and black machinist helpers were numerous in the shops before the strike. Mainly the point that strikers kept returning to was that the Katy could not find enough skilled men. One described a force of painters applying paint very liberally to the engines and wipers shining them up. The local leader exclaimed, "The public may fall for that bunk, but the strikers never will. Painting and shining will not keep them in service. It takes real mechanics to do that." The other big claim was that strikebreakers invariably recognized the exploitative treatment the companies had in store for them. Denison strikers related that the Katy at first was feeding 400 to 500 strikebreakers, but were down to 200 because the strikebreakers were quitting in droves. This was a list of engine failures that they kept track of, that Red kept track of. Thus, to many shopmen, the Katy seemed on the verge of collapse. Waco strikers, for instance, noted that the railroad had 500 loads in the yards and no power to move them. Denison chimed in that the state citizens would soon revolt against the expenses of maintaining troops. Others argued that the railroad's shareholders would force managers to change course given all of the large sums dedicated to erecting bullpens and bunks for strikebreakers, hiring detectives, and importing so many workers without experience in railroad shops only to see freight and passenger cars sit listlessly on the tracks. In contrast to the chaos unfolding in railroad roundhouses, yards, and track, strikers were in the main unified, contributors to the circulars and bulletins held. One cited the mass meeting of shopmen and their wives held in October at Wichita Falls and Greenville. One Katy strike leader's description of Denison strikers was commonplace in this literature. "Those boys are made of metal." This is a publication that was distributed along the Katy lines across the state, across the Katy really, to sort of boost morale. It is unsurprising to find strike literature offering up you know, a rosier version of the situation on the ground then was really warranted, because the purpose of this literature was to boost morale. However, I am impressed by how much effort local Federation heads put into their posts for each Katy circular, which came out more or less on a weekly basis. The posts were usually quite lengthy and again took seriously the point of reporting any mechanical issues that the Katy was having and any breaks in ranks among strikers in that locale. The attention that strike leaders paid to their reports suggests to me that many believed, or at least very much wanted to believe, that they were making progress and they just needed to stick together and they would prevail. Week after week, the circulars boasted that at each locale, the men were holding firm, or staying pat, as they put it. Strikers held the line in part by shaming publicly shopmen who returned to work. These men were scabs, traitors, scalies, and weak sisters, as they put it. They had lost their manhood. The names of returning shopmen were printed in strike literature, usually with an accompanying insult. Another means of rallying the shopmen was with biting humor. One writer in the Katy circular, the Katy Federation circular, related that a passenger had arrived in San Antonio and had dropped dead at the station, probably, he kidded, due to his surprise that his train had arrived on time. Much satiric wit targeted the Katy's announcement that shop employees had to join a company union. That's what the cartoon is poking at here as well. Delegates were picked by company officials, and the company deducted monthly dues to support the organization. So much for the company's open shop, pro-democracy rhetoric, the joke ran. The anecdote sometimes stemmed from a sense of bewilderment at the bizarreness of their situation. The San Antonio Bulletin recounted how one local strike leader was arrested for calling a scab a scab. "We don't know what else to call them," the man protested. Behind these ironic responses to events was a core argument that held many strikers to their fight. The news of the Katy's new company union steeled the determination of the authors of the San Antonio Shopmen's Bulletin, for example. In company unions, they saw a mortal threat to independent unionism, without which a worker is, they said, friendless, alone, and an unorganized atom in the sea of humanity. In this same vein, the Shopmen's Bulletin reprinted an interesting piece authored by Dr. Frank Crane, who was a famous clergyman and columnist of the day. About 10 days earlier, Crane had related the concerns of a locomotive fireman who saw his union as an enemy of his individual liberty. Crane's answer was essentially, "Go west, young man, where supposedly you don't have to deal with tyrannous labor or tyrannous capital." On September 24th, 1922, Crane shared a letter he had received from Rose Gollop Cohen of New York City. Although Crane does not mention this, and perhaps was unaware, Cohen had achieved some small measure of fame for her 1918 autobiography, Out of the Shadow, a Russian Jewish girlhood on the Lower East Side. Cohen made a moral appeal to the firemen. She shared her own experience with unionism. She wrote, "When I was a little child and worked 14 hours a day in the sweatshops, a man came and organized my shop, and our workday became 12 hours. It was very wonderful to have those 2 extra hours. I had long lost the habit of play. It was like a miracle then when through my union, my wages were raised to $5 a week. My hours were reduced 2 hours more, and I was able to run the night school, decently dressed even. The union did this and more for me and for many thousands of others." She advised the firemen to not interfere as a strikebreaker. She implored, "A truly brave, fine man would go do other work, would not find it in his heart to break down what other men are building with their flesh and blood." While the public strike literature sought to shore up strikers' commitment to their cause, the private letters between the local and national leadership acknowledged the challenges accumulating against them in the fall of 22. Striking shopmen and their families were under duress. Cleburne later wrote in late September that 80 to 90 families relied entirely on donations. Solidarity in the form of aid from brotherhood men, especially conductors, amounted to very little. Winter is coming, this shopman worried. Strikers needed winter clothing for their children and coal. They had to pay taxes. His office was besieged with requests. In addition, Red's rearguard strategy of signing the best separate agreements possible with willing railroads put enormous pressure on those who had struck hard-boiled companies such as the Katy. The Katy was holding out aggressively for a near complete victory over Shopmen and was enlisting scare tactics to get them to break ranks, as one railroader said. Even in late December, William Dickerson, who was general chair of the Boilermakers Union in Waco, was not willing to admit we are whipped, he wrote. Our men are still standing firm. The men on the other roads are depending on the Katy, he wrote, to hold their lines and not show the white feather. Still, rumors abounded that men in different locales were caving in, especially with Christmas coming and the little ones expecting gifts. Confusion reigned as to which road had signed what, and the disarray was dispiriting. Only a few weeks before his more resolute letter, Dickerson had reported, some of these men are not very strong anyway. All they want is an excuse for going back to work. Worse, Scott of Red admitted to one Katy strike leader that men at work on roads that had reached an agreement were failing to fulfill their assessment obligation. That assessment was in place to aid those strikers who were still out. They do not stop to realize how insecure their own positions are, Scott confided. The actions of other union men dealt the strikers their greatest blows to morale. In late October, one Texas leader sent on to Red a letter from De Leon, Texas, where lodge members were seeing our jobs taken up here by Brotherhood men from other roads. The leader pushed Red to call on the Brotherhoods to account for their members. Furthermore, the Federation head at Parsons told Scott that he had determined inside men were scabbing. To him, the numbers did not add up. Their men were out at Parsons, almost all out, but the town's shop workforce was steadily on the rise and increasingly stable. The suspicion was that striking shopmen were traveling to other towns to act as strike breakers. In his study, Davis confirms this was a widespread feature of the strike. In the end, the conflict exhausted strikers more than it did the Katy. Between 1923 and 1928, Red received letter after letter from local Katy leaders and their lawyers asking for Red to pay the balance on the legal fees charged to defend shopcraft workers in the courts. One law firm letter explained that the local organization has no funds and that they sought payment of a nearly $2,000 bill for their faithful service to labor's cause in more than a dozen contempt cases and 7 conspiracy cases. Red's answer was that it had never promised to pay. This was the chief defense, but also Red made clear that it was in financial turmoil itself due to its loss of membership and the expenses of carrying out a largely failed walkout. These communications highlight the degree to which the strike's loss had devastated local shopcraft unions. Whereas 400 had belonged to the Machinist Lodge in Cleburne before the strike, by 1923, barely 30 did. Nearly all have left town, one leader explained. He was merely eking out a living for his family there. Another local leader, W.A. Bell, was ashamed of his organization's indebtedness and also feared he would be liable. The lawyers are after me all the time, he lamented. He stood alone holding the bag because the town's federation was no more. A great many of them were laid off, he wrote, and a large majority have left the city and are badly scattered. Bell had even closed the union hall and moved the organization's remaining paperwork to his home. This discussion confirms to me that it is entirely worthwhile to examine how the National Shopman strike unfolded on the ground level. Collin Davis's book takes a more top-down approach and a national perspective, but the question as to how the shopmen in Texas locales understood their own circumstances and tried to deal with them tells a different story, and one that helps to explain the economic and emotional shocks that came with the strike's defeat. From strikers' perspectives at the time, the fall of 1922 was not a time of disintegration necessarily. Many thought that they could still win their fight if they held firm and if they depended on those aspects of life that they knew well and best, their relationship to their neighbors, the bonds of their union, and the value of their expertise in the shops. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and that you have questions.